Hello, my name is Rick Clayton from Health for Animals, and I'm going to take you through this presentation on legislation and guidance. This presentation was given by Yuko Hosoda from the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries in Session 2 of the Global Animal Health Workshops. This presentation will examine the typical regulatory framework that is established to govern veterinary medicinal products, and we will look at the differences between legislation, major international standards and guidelines. Beginning with the topic of legislation, we will briefly examine the typical hierarchy of legislative instruments, and then we will take a look at the differences between legislation or regulation, which is sometimes referred to as hard law, and guidelines, which are sometimes referred to as soft law. So let's look at general law hierarchy for human and veterinary medicinal products using Japan as an example. In Japan, all medicinal products are regulated under the Single Pharmacy Act, and this is true of many countries. The primary legislation, such as an act, is typically adopted by the highest legislative body of a nation, such as an Act of Congress. All secondary legislation is implemented under the primary act. The next layer of legislation under the act are cabinet ordinances, which delegate the power to implement the act to the appropriate government departments. In many countries, including Japan, the human health government sector and the veterinary government sector regulate the human or veterinary medicinal products separately. The next layer are ministerial ordinances or announcements, which typically define the standards to be met. In Japan, some examples of ministerial ordinances include the good laboratory practice, good clinical practice, and good manufacturing practice. It also includes the control regulations of veterinary medicinal products. Some examples of announcements include the biological product standards and national assay laboratory standards. Then the final layer is the notice memorandum or guidances, or these can be called guidelines. These provide the necessary detailed guidance on procedural detail or technical detail. And good examples from this category are all the VICH guidelines on technical requirements. An important difference to note here is that everything in the blue-green boxes is legally binding, such as the Act and the Cabinet ordinances, which is why these are known as hard law. On the other hand, the items in the orange box at the bottom, the notice memorandum and the guidances, are not legally binding. They are not law, even if they are sometimes referred to as soft law, because generally you will need to follow the guidance, but you can deviate from the guidance if you provide good justification for an alternative approach. When developing your legislative framework, it's important to consider the level of detail that you do or do not want to include. The legislation should be kept high level because an act is hard to change and takes a long time, so you want it to be future-proof. It is best not to refer to details such as the titles of guidelines in an act. The details should be kept for the guidelines, which are easier to develop and revise, for example in response to technical and scientific progress. Another issue worthy of reflection is where to place government control over veterinary medicinal products. Some countries include veterinary medicines with human medicines in the government health department, whereas other countries place veterinary medicines in the Department of agriculture due to their importance in controlling animal diseases. Both choices have their advantages and disadvantages. However, because of the large differences in the markets and uses and the risks involved between veterinary and human medicines, it's probably best not to place them together in the human health department, where they will always be the junior partner. The next topic for this presentation is major international standards. But before looking at those, I would like to briefly come back to the One Health concept, which has already been mentioned in session 1. An understanding of the One Health concept is important to help ensure there is political support for coordinated prevention of major public health and animal diseases at the human-animal interface. For example, human contact with livestock animals on the farm or companion animals in the home. A government's policy on veterinary medicinal products is an integral part of the overall national animal health policy, and this policy needs to ensure the veterinary services have access to veterinary drugs, and that those veterinary drugs are sure, secure and efficient, or in other words, are of appropriate quality, safety and efficacy. These regulatory controls and standards are necessary to protect animal health, to protect human health, for example from residues in food, from zoonosis and from the risks of antimicrobial resistance, and they are necessary for environmental safety. The solution to the One Health challenge is firstly to have a holistic and coordinated approach to management across the animal, food and human health sectors. And secondly, to develop improved intersectorial collaboration, for example through joint steering committees or multidisciplinary teams, where regulations of medicines and disease control are managed by different entities. And what do we need to help implement these policies? Well, of great importance are, firstly, international standards in order to harmonize the protocols and the methodologies that are used. And secondly, the legislation to ensure access to quality drugs and to impose restrictions on use where this is necessary for their correct and safe use. And good structures to ensure good governance of all sectors related to authorization and use of veterinary medicinal products. Turning now to major international standards for veterinary medicinal products, I will mention the two most important bodies in this context. Firstly, the OIE. The OIE sets standards for good governance of veterinary medicinal products, including specific parts of its terrestrial code, and there's also an aquatic code, concern legislation. It also has standards for the management of antimicrobial resistance and standards for manufacturing and quality control. But of equal importance, the OIE has a specific program, the PVS pathway, which is for capacity building of veterinary services at a national level. And this is very important to ensure that veterinary medicinal products are used when needed and appropriately and correctly. The other major international body is Codex. Now Codex sets food safety standards, which is a very different area, and it has guidelines and related texts to help with establishing maximum residue limits in food, and also codes of practice to protect consumers and to ensure fair practices in the food trade. Now both the OIE standards and the Codex food standards are recognized by the World Trade Organization as references for international trade. So those are the primary examples. Another body is VICH, which we've mentioned earlier. VICH does not cover any of the topics covered by OIE or Codex. In fact, VICH does not set standards. VICH is a body that develops technical guidance on how to conduct these studies that may be required by regulatory authorities for the registration of a veterinary medicinal product before it can be placed on the market. The third and final part of this presentation is about preparing guidelines. Let's look at some of the important characteristics that you need to consider building into your guideline development process. Firstly, flexibility versus transparency. And here we are not just referring to transparency in the guideline development process. A guideline needs to be sufficiently flexible to be relevant to a range of different situations. Every product is different, but it must not be so flexible that it is not transparent to the user what is required. So it must also provide clear guidance. And secondly, stakeholder input through public consultation during the development of the guideline is important. This is to ensure the end user can use the guideline. And it's also important to ensure you have access to the best scientific advice. And finally, how animal welfare is protected needs to be considered. The guidelines need to respect the 3 R's principles where animals are used during product development. The technical guidelines should be built on consensus. In other words, all parties that must use the guidelines, both regulators and manufacturers or end users, must have the opportunity to input so that the primary of the objectives of the guideline are understood and the limitations of the stakeholders are understood. So let's review some of the key points that have been mentioned. Guidelines should follow the current science. This helps to allow mutual acceptance of data between national competent authorities. Guidelines should also prevent the unnecessary repetition of animal testing. And again, this comes back a little bit to the mutual acceptance of data so that studies are not repeated. Guidelines occasionally need to be updated, so the system needs to be flexible to allow that. Guidelines are legally non-binding, sometimes referred to as soft law. They are a strong recommendation from the regulator, but being legally non-binding, you can deviate from the guideline if you can give a sufficient justification for your approach. And guidelines need the support from all stakeholders because all stakeholders have to be able to apply the guideline. As an example, let's look at the VICH guideline creation process. This is a 9-step procedure and it has 4 stages. The first stage is the drafting step, and in step 1 the steering committee takes the decision based on the need for the guideline or some other justification to start a topic, and it will then appoint an expert working group to work on the development of that guideline. The expert working group is composed of experts on that topic from all the VICH countries and regions. And this group in step 2 elaborates the draft guideline, and when it's satisfied it passes it back to the steering committee in step 3, which approves the draft guideline for public consultation. The next phase is the fine-tuning. In step 4, the draft guideline is circulated to the stakeholders and the public for the public consultation process. In step 5, the comments from that public consultation are collected and reviewed, and the expert working group will prepare a revised guideline, trying to take those comments into account where appropriate. And then in step 6, the guideline goes back to the steering committee, which approves the revised guideline. And in this step, it's important to note that it is only the regulators who make the final approval of the final draft. Then, in the publishing stage, the final guideline is circulated to the competent authorities of the VICH regions, where it is published on their websites, and the final guideline is then implemented in the VICH regions, usually with a transition period to allow stakeholders to prepare. The final and 9th step is the maintenance phase, where the steering committee will monitor and maintain and review the guideline to see whether it needs any revisions or updates. How to keep transparency in the guideline development process. VICH is an international body, but how is the 9-step process implemented at a national level? Again, let's use Japan as an example, and I'll describe how the national bodies and experts are involved in the process and how the public consultation fits in. As we've seen on the previous slide, the process starts with the drafting of a guideline, and this is done by an expert working group involving both government experts from the relevant government section responsible for veterinary medicinal products and industry experts coming from the companies that are developing veterinary medicinal products. These experts do not work alone, and they have plenty of support behind them to advise on the scientific and technical details, and to give the experts their mandate for discussions within the expert working group. The government expert has the support and the scientific or technical input coming from the relevant government bodies, such as the Food Safety Commission or the Ministry of Health, and also relevant national councils, such as the Pharmaceutical Affairs Committee. The industry expert, on the other side, has the support of other industry experts within an industry expert committee, typically coordinated and organized by the Industry Trade Association. When the joint expert working group has prepared a draft guideline, the government will publish it on its website and notify its stakeholders of the public consultation. Transparency is enhanced by giving the public sufficient time to comment, usually at least 3 months or up to 6 months. And transparency is also enhanced by publishing, with permission, the comments received during the public consultation. At the end of the public consultation period, the comments are reviewed by the expert working group, which then produces a second draft of the guideline reflecting, where appropriate, all those comments. The draft guideline is then submitted for approval to the governing body, such as the VICH Steering Committee in our example, and sent to the participating governments for publication and implementation at a national or regional level. That is the end of this presentation, so thank you for your attention, and a special thank you goes to Yuko Hosoda for preparing this presentation. This and more presentations on good regulatory practice can be found on the Health for Animals website and on the VetMed World website. Thank you.